Welcome to World Horse Welfare's virtual conference on maintaining public acceptance of equestrianism, a unique event that aims to help us all to learn from the expertise and experience of others. We are delighted to welcome so many of you here today, an audience that quite literally spans the globe and that includes representatives of a multitude of equestrian disciplines and sectors. And we are so grateful to our speakers, all of whom have given up their time today to share their valuable insights gained as they have charted a route for their own industries, both equestrian and non-equestrian, through the ever-changing world of public acceptance. By way of an introduction to the topic of public acceptance of equestrianism, we're now going to show a short video.
For almost 100 years, World Horse Welfare has been improving welfare within the horse-human relationship through care, research, education and influence. We help horses in need, horses in work and production, and horses in sport and leisure. World Horse Welfare supports the ethical involvement of horses in sport and is a critical friend of the horse sport industry. We are an independent welfare advisor to the FEI, the International Horse Sport Confederation and the British Horse Racing Authority, and provide advice to other national federations. Our role now is more important than ever. Public acceptance of the involvement of horses in sport and even leisure is under growing scrutiny. Society is suspicious of the use of animals in entertainment. They're worried about how horses are bred, cared for, trained, competed, and what happens to them when their careers are over. Horse sport's social licence to operate is increasingly being challenged. At the same time, our knowledge of what horses need to have good welfare and a good life is expanding. Many in the horse world now understand that some traditional practices must change, and there are aspects of horse sport that they don't like. Horse sport knows they need to address this, and some regulators are making real progress to improve practices and perceptions of the welfare and safety of horses in sport. But could they progress even further, faster, by learning from other industries that have faced the same challenges? What can we learn from industries that have emerged stronger after listening to public concerns and working to address them? Following World Horse Welfare's published research on this question, today we will hear from other industry leaders on how they're addressing the challenges posed by the changing perceptions of society and science about animals, and turning these challenges into opportunities for a sustainable future.
Today is all about how to maintain the public acceptance of horse sport. This concept is often referred to as social licence to operate. So what is social licence? As I'm sure many of you know, it has nothing to do with the law. It isn't something you can apply for or be awarded, or award to yourself. In essence, social licence is a dynamic, intangible, unwritten contract between society and those who are involved in an industry or activity. And it describes the degree to which the public accepts that activity. In a nutshell, as a measure of society's trust in the activity's proponents to behave ethically, legally, and responsibly. In 2022, World Horse Welfare published a review that focused on what equestrian sport can learn from other industries that have worked to strengthen their own social licence, the same focus as today's conference. But why are we as a welfare organisation writing papers and convening this conference for more than 200 horse sport leaders on maintaining public acceptance? We have done this because we support horses being ridden and involved in sport, now and in the future, because we believe this can be good for both horses and humanity, as long as horse sport conducts itself ethically and responsibly, and in a way that prioritises the welfare of the horse. But this future is at risk, largely because a substantial proportion of the public and equestrians believe that we need to do better on welfare. So in order to maintain a social licence, equine welfare must become an even bigger focus for horse sport than it already is. Looking at public acceptance data from the UK, in May 2023, we commissioned YouGov, an independent public opinion and data analysis company, to conduct a survey of a representative sample of more than 4,000 members of the British public. As shown here, 20% of the respondents did not support the continued involvement of horses in sport in any circumstances, and 42% only supported it if welfare improved. Note that the 20% and the 42% are additive, so that's more than 60% who didn't like the status quo. And it's not only the public who felt this way. People who interacted regularly with horses had similar views. Our survey of the previous year also showed almost identical results. These UK survey results are echoed by those from 2 international surveys, again carried out by an independent company for the FEI's Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission in 2022. In a survey of the public that involved 14,000 respondents from 14 countries, 52% thought that welfare standards for horses in sport needed improving. And when equestrian stakeholders are asked the same question, 78% of almost 28,000 respondents from 116 countries agreed. So it's not only the public who think that equestrianism has a welfare challenge. What might underlie these sentiments? This image shows the main factors that are known to influence public acceptance in other industries, the most fundamental of which is trust. And because we know how central trust is to social movements, we included in our 2023 survey some questions about the extent to which respondents trusted to 4 different groups when it came to equine welfare. These groups were the media, riders, trainers, coaches and owners, horse sport regulators and leisure riders, who are defined as people who ride for leisure but not competitive sport. For the media, respondents were asked to what extent they trusted the information presented about equine welfare. For the other 3 groups, they were asked the extent to which they trusted these people to put horses' welfare first. In the graphs that follow, the responses of those who trusted these groups are shown in blue, those who didn't trust them in the yellow, and those who didn't know or weren't sure in grey. So here are the data for those who tended to trust these groups to put welfare first. And the good news is that at least a quarter of the public were generally trustful. And this rose to over 60% for leisure riders, a group that was most trusted by quite a margin. Now here are the data for those who didn't trust or tended not to trust. And the good news here is that for all sectors, no more than a quarter of the public are mistrustful. And again, leisure riders came off rather better than the other groups. And finally, here are the data for those respondents who didn't know or weren't sure whether they trusted or not. It appears that the public were more likely to be sure of their answer when it came to leisure riders, but not so much those involved in sport. These unsures and don't knows represent a substantial proportion of all respondents. All this indicates that acceptance of the involvement of horses in sport, as it currently stands, is not a given. Many people do not fully trust those involved in horse sport to put horses' welfare first, and many more have not made up their minds. Way more than our words, our actions in the coming months and years will determine whether we can earn and maintain their trust. But in attempting to do that, we do not need to step into the unknown. The stories of courage and vision and challenging the status quo that you're about to hear from our speakers today will hopefully leave you feeling that with this challenge comes a real opportunity for equestrianism. By the end of the day, I hope that we'll all go back to our communities and share what we've learned with the confidence that we can change our organisations and our attitude to what is possible and what is in our best interests, and that we will be inspired by the opportunity that change can bring to help horse sport achieve long-term growth and sustainability. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ingmar de Vos. Ingmar has a wealth of knowledge and experience across the equestrian sector, having held senior roles in administration, governance, and management of equestrian sport at national, regional, and international level for over 30 years. He is currently FEI President and is a member of the International Olympic Committee. Under his leadership, the FEI has earned a strong standing in the Olympic community for its sustainability initiatives, advances in animal welfare, championing of gender diversity, equity and inclusion, and promotion of youth sport. Today, he will talk about public acceptance of equestrianism, a view from horse sport. Ingmar.
Distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, I am delighted to be part of this ambitious conference set up by our trusted partner, World Horse Welfare, and to have this unique opportunity to engage with external industries and experts around a topic I am deeply passionate about. And not only because it's part of my remit as FEI President to ensure a sustainable future for our sport and hence to secure the public's acceptance, but also because I know how valuable equestrian sport and the horse-human relationship is to society, and I know what's at stake. Now, before I go any further, I want to clarify that this opening message has been pre-recorded, hence the perfect lighting and angles. But I'm also attending the conference online. This was done partly for convenience, so that we did not have to worry about any technical glitches, but also so that we could include some graphics. For a long time, equestrian sports have enjoyed a special status in the public eye, because we are a unique sport and a unique community. First of all, our biggest asset, the horse, of course, a beautiful and majestic animal which has fascinated people around the world for thousands of years. We are also an Olympic and Paralympic sport and have been in the Olympic movement for over a century. And our participants are very diverse, with different cultural backgrounds and traditions, with men and women of all ages competing together and against each other, which is unique in the sporting world. We have many different disciplines and different audiences around the world, and last but not least, we have certainly had our share of famous equestrian personalities and inspiring stories of individuals and horses. But in recent years, we have come under scrutiny, and we have seen a shift in the public's perception of equestrianism based on growing concerns and increased media attention around the welfare and the well-being of horses in sport. A shift which we have taken very seriously and represents the biggest priority in terms of what we need to address in order to future-proof our sport for generations to come. But this was not a simple shift in perception, public seeks reassurance, equals community gets on board and takes the necessary actions. Quite the opposite. One of the first big challenges of our community was actually to acknowledge that shift and accept that the public had the right to question our sport, and that it would be in our interest to listen what they had to say, rather than put the responsibility on the public to make the effort to get to know us better, and that we don't need their input because we are fine in our bubble. And at the same time, we also had to accept that in the eyes of the public, all horse sports are often treated as one and the same. If you take the example of the incident during the modern pentathlon at the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, there was no distinction in the public eye between FEI disciplines and modern pentathlon. The fact is, although it was a jumping competition taking place at the Olympic Games, it is completely out of FEI's jurisdiction. But this is very hard to explain to the public and basically unacceptable to them. And this clearly illustrates also that the responsibility does not rest just with the FEI, but the entire community. And we are only as strong as the weakest link. When it comes to this concept of reach, we also face the challenge that we can only act against people that are members and registered as FEI, so part of our FEI community. We do not have the tools to sanction people outside our system. For the ones within our system, we did recently change our rules so we can now also act outside the jurisdiction of FEI events, especially when it comes to horse welfare. But prior to that, it was complicated as well. But we made an exception for horse welfare and extended the jurisdiction beyond the duration of our events. We have elaborate rules for welfare. We have a strong code of conduct. We have a reciprocal system with our national federations. We reaffirm and communicate our values, which are centered on always placing the welfare of the horse first. But the reality is we don't have the overarching reach and power which is sometimes assumed of us. So there are the main challenges I believe we are facing. Accepting that it's the entire equestrian community's responsibility and duty to change and meet the public's expectations. Embracing the connection the public makes between all horse sports and using that connection in our favor by working more effectively with our counterparts to drive change from grassroots to the top level. And ultimately finding a way to reconcile the scope of what is expected of us, what we can influence directly and indirectly, and how we go about that from a strategic perspective. We collaborate regularly with national or regional veterinary authorities such as USDA and DG Santé of the European Commission on matters related to ensuring the highest standards of equine health and well-being at FEI events. And we invest and cooperate on many research projects which are welfare-driven, such as the limb hyper and hyposensitivity programs, the footing project, and the global equine anti-doping and control medication program, just to name a few. Because we know science-backed research is essential in order to drive and implement change or impose new rules and legislation. In terms of governance and decision-making protocols, we have a very transparent system in place which is based on consultation with the community, our community. And from an education and communications perspective, we have continued to develop our free online platform FEI Campus to include additional welfare-related content as well as horse well-being content on our digital and social media platforms. So, while we have certainly not been complacent in recent years, there was clearly more that needed to be done in order to consolidate our efforts and address the concerns of the public if we wanted to continue to have the public's approval and validation. And for this, we decided we needed an external and independent perspective that would help establish the bigger picture and set a framework of action, which is what led to the creation of the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission in 2022. The 10-person commission was chaired by Professor Nathalie Waran from New Zealand, an internationally respected equine welfare expert, and included members considered as external and even sometimes critical of the FEI, including also a representative of World Horse Welfare. We set out a clear terms of reference for their 18-month mandate, which came to an end last November at the FEI General Assembly, where they delivered their final report, A Good Life for Horses. And this report went straight to the FEI board. The report refers to 6 priority areas. First, training and riding, tack and equipment. Secondly, recognizing physical and emotional stress. Thirdly, accountability, enforcement and knowledge. Fourth, the other 23 hours. 5, competitive drive, the horse as a number or object. And finally, number 6, fitness to compete, masking health problems. During their mandate, the Commission conducted several surveys with an exceptionally high rate of participation, which tells us just how relevant the topic of horse welfare is for the community, but also for the general public. All of this resulted in 30 recommendations which they presented to the FEI board and that are now being carefully reviewed by the board and the FEI headquarters and will contribute to a larger strategy and concrete measures the FEI will be presenting at the Sports Forum in 3 months' time. For me, it was important that the Commission was not an academic or philosophical exercise only, or a PR stunt to silence the detractors, but rather a body of work and a framework that addressed both the issues as well as the processes needed to maintain our social license and ensure we were leading and not reacting when it came to equine welfare and well-being matters. Of course, there is no single strategy which is going to secure us forever, because we don't operate in a vacuum, and what is relevant today may not be relevant tomorrow. But I believe we will be far better equipped following this process of self and external reflection to stay ahead of the curve. And guaranteeing this continuity is, by the way, part of one of these recommendations. So what do we need to do? We need to be accountable. We need to be proactive and embrace reform. We need to champion the very best of our sports with data-driven and science-backed research, policies and legislation so that we can ensure and promote the very highest standards of equine welfare. And finally, we need to educate and ensure there is a collective responsibility to uphold those same standards outside our areas of jurisdiction, so that horse welfare and well-being is at the core of everything and everyone in the horse world. But we can't do this alone. We need the acceptance and engagement of the entire equine community, because as I said earlier, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And there is no doubt that together we are stronger. Together we are stronger, which is also the Olympic motto. Detractors can shout loud, but if we are all consistent and coherent in our actions, in the standards we apply in our communications, if we can show just how much we care and do for the welfare of the horse, and on the flip side, how much the horse and horse sports contribute to society, then I believe we can go further than maintain the public's acceptance. We can secure their appreciation for what we do and for what our sport brings to society. Dear friends, I could probably go on forever, but my time is surely up. Thank you to World Horse Welfare for your continued commitment and for organizing this webinar. I look forward to the presentations ahead and discussing how we can harness our collective knowledge for the good of the horses and all individuals and communities whose livelihoods and well-being depend on it. Thank you.
Ingmar, thank you so much for getting us off to such a good start on today's conference around social license and public acceptability of horse sport. And now I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who is Chris Riggs. Chris has been Director of the Equine Welfare Research Foundation and Chief Advisor for Mainland Veterinary Engagement at the Hong Kong Jockey Club since 2019, having joined as Head of Veterinary Clinical Service in 2003. Chris is an experienced veterinarian whose clinical interests centre on surgery and orthopaedics. His PhD focused on the causes of racehorse fractures, and he retains a particular interest in the role that fatigue damage in bone plays in the risk of racehorse fractures. Today, Chris will talk about public acceptance of equestrianism, a view from horse racing. Chris.
Roly, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and it's a very great honour to join this panel and make a contribution from horse racing. There's no doubt for anyone involved with racing that there are many in society who have concerns about racing, and some indeed who are very critical. These concerns certainly put our social license to operate under threat, and we need to be very cognizant of that and very responsive to that. Some of the perceptions that cause concern among people in society are that horses are abused simply for the sake of entertainment and perhaps worse, gambling, they might say. The sport is just too dangerous. We see images of horses breaking their legs, dropping down sometimes with sudden cardiac disease. There's a feeling among some that racing fails to live up to the responsibility to care for horses after they cease to be useful. And among some, that racing is arrogant and fails to engage with the very people who are concerned and want to be taken seriously. There are clearly three critical factors that need to be taken into consideration by racing when considering how to stem a negative tide that grows in some places and really make clear that huge efforts are made to make things better and that people really do care. We need, of course, to ensure that vital factors, and I'll explain those in a moment, are in order. We need to genuinely commit and be seen to be committed to making improvements and illustrating that with action and change. And we need to engage the society in a way that society really believes. So vital factors I consider are the fundamental elements of caring for the animal, which we simply must have in place to ensure that the welfare of the horse is guaranteed. So for instance, good husbandry need to make sure that stabling is appropriate. The horses are managed suitably, fed properly, and more tangible or more subtle factors are we providing stimuli to support their mental health? Clearly, there must be very good care of these animals, particularly those involved in intense athletic activity where injuries are occasionally inevitable. We need to have strict regulation to make sure that there is strong governance and severe penalties for those who would abuse the horse. We need to have systems in place that monitor the incidence of injury and disease. So if something goes wrong, we can detect it at the earliest possible level and respond accordingly. And we need to make sure that those horses which have finished their racing career are not just dumped. They are cared for. They are given an opportunity to have an ongoing life, which is of high quality. So other than those things, which are absolute givens, which we must do, we must also continue to improve and never take anything for granted. Those responsible for caring really any animals, but particularly in this instance, racehorses where people see they're simply there for people's entertainment. We should never be content that we're doing well enough and never give that impression that we are. We should ensure that the breeding of horses is suitable to match the need. There should not be, and there should not be a perception that excess number of horses are being bred simply to make profits. We need to work hard constantly to reduce the incidence of injuries among racehorses. Repetitive stress injuries are common in racehorses just as they're common in other animals or humans that are undertaking intense athletic activity. We need research to improve the detection of repetitive stress injury at an early age and ideally prevent it. We need to reduce the prevalence of disease associated with cardiac and pulmonary issues. And we need to also develop techniques that allow us to quantify the happiness of a horse. We don't just want the racehorse's life to be acceptable. We want it to be really good. And we don't want to assume that we can determine what that is. We need science to allow us to get the horses to tell us what is good from them, from their perspective. We need to improve strategies and techniques all the time that detect those who would do bad things at the horse's expense. And we constantly need to look at how we can look after horses after they're retired with better and better options. We also need to ensure that we engage with society and engage with those who are concerned and worried in a truly respectful way. Most societies want increasing control over what impacts their feelings, and that's reasonable and understandable, and they expect to be heard and respected. And when they're not, that causes resentment, loss of trust. We need to be open when incidents happen. We need to explain clearly what has happened and describe it in sufficient detail for people to understand and not cover it over. We need to listen and hear what the concerns of society are and share facts in a straightforward and in a manner that is easy to understand. We need to deal with truth, not grandiose statements like horses are treated like kings. People want to know if they've just seen a horse suffer a terrible injury, they want a much more truthful engagement than that. We need to be empathetic with the people who are concerned. We need to make it clear that we feel just as upset and hurt. If a horse breaks down, coming up with bold statements about how we're doing the best in the world, these horses are the best looked after than anywhere else in the world, what it might be, doesn't ring true. We hate it just as much as everyone else on a horse breaks down. We want to stop that happening. It is a very challenging aspect of racing, and we are resolved to fund research, to engage in research, to make it better. We don't accept that it is something that we can live with longer than we have to. We also acknowledge that being heard and respected is increasingly considered a fundamental human right, and we don't underestimate the level of knowledge and intellect of society. Most, if not all, people in society now can gain access to the latest research and gain a very clear understanding of what is being followed and what's being published in this field, and have a highly intellectual view on it. At its base, racing provides a good life for horses. Also, it adds richness to the lives of humanity. Thoroughbreds are beautiful creatures, and generally they're well cared for. These great creatures would not be in our lives nearly to the extent that they are if it wasn't for racing. It provides an opportunity for very positive interaction between humans and animals, and in some places, it allows an introduction to animals to a whole spectrum of society who would otherwise never get such a vision. It provides healthy employment for people, preservation of land as pasture land, and it provides entertainment for many people. Also, in certain models, such as that of the Hong Kong Jockey Club, revenue gained from gambling is a very, very important additional funding for society. There are bad things to racing too, and we must acknowledge that and acknowledge that they're not acceptable. We are determined to improve them. Racehorses are indeed at risk of injuries simply as a result of the physical demands of intense athletic sport. How can we modify training? How can we detect early injuries sooner and prevent them developing into more serious cases? And how do we manage those horses so that we're constantly improving? The mental well-being of horses is increasingly an issue that we have to consider. And there is a danger that it might be compromised by training routines. We should not take it for granted that they're not. Horses may be neglected after racing, and that is unacceptable. There are indeed people who would abuse horses out of greed, and we must acknowledge that threat and manage it. We must acknowledge all these threats, openly commit to solving them, and engage collaboratively with the society to get their input in doing so, to demonstrate that we are resolved to change and we don't accept things are perfect by a very long way, and we are committed to improving it. We need to racing needs to invest in resources to minimize the risks through research and, as Ingmar has just said, evidence-based guidance. The rules that focus on protecting the welfare of horses must be preeminent. And we must constantly look at ways of improving training of horses so that we can improve or reduce the incidence of injuries and meet society's evolving expectations. These are all challenges for racing, and I do believe racing has woken up to them and is responding to try and improve them. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for that thought-provoking speech. We've had two very excellent speakers from the equestrian world, and now with our next speaker, we are moving outside of the horse world, because we believe there's so much that equestrianism can learn from those who have walked this path before us. As we know, since time immemorial, the shifting sand of society's belief and ethical standards have given industry leaders across the world pause for thought. Some organisations and industries have failed to recognise this, as a consequence have fallen by the wayside, but many others have risen to the challenge, emerging stronger and more confidently, fully committed to reflecting the values of the societies in which they operate. Today, we are fortunate to be able to learn from the experience and insight of some of the people who have successfully helped other industries to overcome and ultimately to benefit from a challenge to their public acceptability. And the first of these is Bob Langert, who led McDonald's corporate social responsibility and sustainability efforts for more than 25 years, and who has been recognised globally for his leadership and influence in business ethics. Bob was McDonald's first vice president to lead on sustainability, with contributions that spanned numerous issues, including sustainable fish, coffee, palm oil, beef, packaging, animal welfare, protection of the animal rainforest, human nutrition, and corporate social responsibility reporting, measurement, and accountability. Bob currently provides corporate sustainability consulting through Mainstream Sustainability, a practice based in Florida. Today, he will talk about lessons learned from the sustainability battlefield, from reactive, peripheral, and a nuisance to strategic, integrated, and opportunistic. Bob.
I've been looking forward to joining you today and sharing our journey. I see already that we have many things in common. I'm not sure how much of a nuisance you consider all these issues. Believe me, at the beginning of our journey, we thought these attacks on our brand were silly. It's like, why are they attacking McDonald's? We're good people. We have good ethics. But we learned over time to take these issues, very seriously. Just a word about McDonald's, that maybe you think you know McDonald's because we're on every street corner, but a couple of things that make our work interesting as it relates to you. I mean, can you believe that McDonald's serves 70 million people a day? That's 1% of the world population. And I don't think there's another entity that studies the consumer more than McDonald's. So when I'm talking about these issues today, believe me, I think most of our consumers are your consumers as well. And one thing we learned, it was very hard to find people that didn't care about our organization being responsible. That's a really important finding. The consumer doesn't know technically what we should do, but they feel we should do the right thing in our business. And the other thing that's interesting about our business, 40,000 restaurants, that's a lot of business across 120 countries. But we are owned by 95% individual owner operators. That equals 5,000 people around the world that own McDonald's. They're the ones that paid me my paycheck. And what that means for what we call sustainability or protecting our brand, what it means is we couldn't just top down say, hey, let's change this policy, let's do this, let's do that. We had to get the support of individual entrepreneurs. And if you know the McDonald's entrepreneur, they want to save every penny they can get to make more money for their business. So we had to approach all these public issues in a way that was acceptable to an entrepreneur. Now, I think you invited me here today because, as my title of my talk is, this battlefield. I love my job, by the way, but every day when I came into work, I thought I was, fighting a battle. We had so many different activists coming after us, books and movies. I mean, how many of you have read Fast Food Nation to think that this anti-McDonald's book was read by so many college students around the world? We had all types of campaigns against us, and it was mentioned all the issues. We were blamed for creating obesity, destroying the rainforest, contributing to the garbage crisis, abusing animals, destroying the rainforest. It was mind-boggling. It was mind-boggling that my own friends and neighbors started to question the integrity and honor of McDonald's. So we had to come up with a way to get out of the target zone. So I really thought long and hard about what are the lessons learned? What can we share with you today to make your journey a little bit easier than our journey? Because I often call our journey the journey of hard knocks. And so that's what I'm going to do, is share what we did well. I'm going to share what we didn't do well and some of our mistakes. Let me start with the first battle. And this first battle was all about waste. And in this battle, I really felt that I earned a PhD on how to handle societal issues. Because in 1989, this package, I'm not sure those of you that remember it, but it was quite infamous, the polystyrene container, it became a symbol of waste. And McDonald's was in the big target zone for being the #1 contributor to the global garbage crisis. Now you got to think of us back in Oak Brook, Illinois, Chicago. We're a Midwest company. We were always loved as a brand. McDonald's was created and formed in 1955, and up until the late 80s, everybody loved McDonald's. We were the dream neighborhood. People loved our owner-operators. And all of a sudden, school kids had big campaigns sending this polystyrene container, thousands of them, to our mailroom from around the world. We had Ronald McDonald transformed into Ronald McToxic. So I can't overstate the feelings that we had in the attacks on our brand. So we had to do something about this, because we couldn't continue with this type of attack on our brand. So here I turn to a picture that tells a big, big story. We made big news back in 1990 by announcing a partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund. My boss, who was the top lawyer for the company, had decided that, hey, rather than be defensive and wait around and have all these critics continue to attack us, we reached out to the Environmental Defense Fund to create a collaboration to reduce waste within McDonald's. And by the way, back in 1990, this was literally unheard of. This idea of a big corporation getting in bed with a big environmental group. And even I thought, by the way, my boss plucked me. I was a packaging manager at the time. I was put in charge of solving this issue with our team at McDonald's. So I was very concerned about working with the outside world, working with our critics. I was thinking these people here that you see in the picture were going to be tree huggers that had no sense of our business. But we did two things we kind of formed a contract, an agreement with the Environmental Defense Fund. We said, #1, don't be looking to change our business model. Don't be looking to change McDonald's into something we are not. We are a quick service restaurant. We're not going to turn into a sit-down fancy restaurant. And the second thing that we insisted upon is that they come up with practical answers. We insisted that they work in our restaurant for a day, as you see in this picture. And I grew to admire the Environmental Defense Fund people. They were smart. They were friends. They became friends. I liked them a lot. And we learned that they wanted our best interests in mind. The Environmental Defense Fund, up until this time, by the way, was known by their motto to sue the bastard. So they had this kind of contentious approach to corporations and entities. But they had a new president named Fred Krupp, who believed in collaborating with business, that the environment and business go together hand in hand. You can be good for the environment, good for business. And he believed in that. And all that came true in this partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund. let me tell you, we had spectacular results. Over the course of the 6-month partnership, we reduced 42 things in our business. We dumped that polystyrene container. We changed to brown bags, which, by the way, is a lot better, the unbleached fiber. We reduced our napkins by 2 inches, and believe it or not, that saves 20 million pounds of paper a year. So every small thing we did at McDonald's was a big change. You know, all in all, during the decade of the 90s, we measured that we reduced 300 million tons of waste in McDonald's. And here's the thing: it's like we won the trifecta. Number one, we went from the outhouse, we went from being the villain, the enemy, to becoming a perceived environmental leader. We actually went to the White House to get an award. Secondly, we actually did good for the world, as I just mentioned. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, we found all these moves very compatible with running a good business. In general, we brought in efficiencies, reducing our resources. And as I came to learn with almost all these issues that I'll talk about, it wasn't a matter of spending more money. It was really more spending our money more wisely. We didn't spend an extra nickel on all these changes. And I want to emphasize here the external support we got from these groups. I just feel it's essential to work in collaboration with the outside world, because we can't do this alone. If McDonald's made all these changes by ourselves, I don't think we would have gotten any credit for it. You need to work with a credible group like the Environmental Defense Fund, and there's many of them out there that are strong and independent, but want to see the business be successful. As you can see from this quote from Fred Krupp, this support that we had, to me, it's worth millions of dollars for McDonald's. We couldn't buy ads that would do better than this third-party support that we had. So I mentioned that we had a PhD in learning about how to deal with these issues. And this is our big learning. This is kind of the formula that I'll be talking about a little bit more. These are 3 things that I think are essential to making things happen, to get out of the target zone into being, perceived as being proactive. One is this idea of being open. And we'll talk more about what that means, but it means inviting people in. With the Environmental Defense Fund, we agreed that they could see anything they wanted to. They could review any document. They could talk to anyone in our business. Complete open doors. We were not going to hide one thing. We truly collaborated. This was not a PR stunt. We actually wanted to collaborate and reduce waste, but we made sure that we weren't going to just do things to do things. We wanted to do things that were practical in our business. Everything we did was practical, and it needed to be actionable actions. We needed to have proof points, and I told you we did 42 things to reduce waste with McDonald's. So, to me, this is our template for the future. Now, our second battle happened during the decade of the 80s and 90s as well. As you can imagine, McDonald's is in the target zone on animal rights. And it's predictable, isn't it? By the way, anything we buy from beef, poultry, pork, we buy 2% of all the meat in the world. So 2%, that's a lot of meat. So obviously we're going to be a target. These are pretty ugly graphics, and I can't tell you how ugly it was for the activists coming after us during the decade of the 80s and 90s. And finally, we were baffled as to what to do with this issue, because so many of the animal issues normally are far removed from McDonald's. I mean, McDonald's, we just buy patties from a meat supplier. The raising of cattle is 3 or 4 steps removed from our supplier influence. So what the heck can we do? And we didn't do anything for a long time. So finally, my boss in 1998 told me, Bob, you got to come up with a program that is proactive on animal welfare. So we put a team together. And just to summarize the key issues that were at hand, we had to deal with the likes of the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals coming after us. Believe me, they were ugly, they were effective, and they got a lot of media attention. And it was hard to deal with the issues. These pictures of 12 hens crammed into a cage that's only the size of a piece of paper. Those mother sows that you see there that can only go up and down and never get to move around at all. There are many undercover videos being released. So, you know, when I started to visit suppliers and ask them about all these things, the scientists would say the animals they're healthy, they're happy. And I didn't like what I heard, you know, because I thought there's a little bit more to this than just measuring, you know, different attributes scientifically of the animal. Now, that's what makes probably animal welfare the most fascinating part of the work I did for McDonald's, because it had this whole idea of ethics and what's the right thing to do. You know, animals aren't napkins and they're not clamshells. They're living human beings. And so our team, we agreed within McDonald's that we're going to work on these issues. I mean, there's no denying that, hey, we serve meat and we're proud to serve meat. We don't see a problem with it. I don't. But on the other hand, we wanted our suppliers to go beyond just being efficient and provide affordable food. We wanted to have care and responsibility too. So how are we going to do that? And the way that we approached it is we had to counteract the emotional attacks of PETA and other groups with science in a high-profile way. So we formed a Blue Ribbon Council, the Animal Welfare Council. 7 of the leading experts around the world, somewhat similar to what I heard in the previous presentations. And again, we followed the formula of openness, collaboration, and trying to set forth actions. And the key thing that we did is we decided to work with, as our lead scientist, Dr. Temple Grandin. Now, Dr. Temple Grandin has spent a lot of time with horses, by the way, and maybe this audience knows of her. If you haven't heard of her, please Google her. She is a phenomenal human being, probably the leading expert on animal behavior. And at this time, I really didn't know of her reputation back in the late 90s, but we started to work with her. And my goodness, what a special treat it was. Now, Temple had these ideas, blue sky ideas, that you could measure animal welfare scientifically, i.e., measure in a slaughterhouse, measure the moves. The more moves, the worse it is. You can measure slips and falls. You can measure the use of electric prods in moving the animals. So she had this animal auditing system, and we decided to basically give her the keys to the McDonald's supply chain. And I helped introduce her to our suppliers. Our suppliers at first were fairly resistant to working with her. As you probably know, most organizations, and I would say especially the meat industry, they're not looking for external people to tell them what to do. And so that was a big hurdle we had to get over. But the beauty of Temple was that she was not out to destroy the meat industry. She was just out to make the welfare of the animals the best that they could. She actually wanted the meat industry to thrive and survive, but she wanted to have much better treatment of animals. And this was our key strategy overall with this issue. Is it wasn't about animal rights, which means a whole different thing than animal welfare. So animal welfare is where we want to lead on her philosophy, which we made our philosophy, is keep the animals free of abuse, neglect, and cruelty. So we ended up being successful in implementing this animal welfare program. It's probably the thing that I'm most proud of that I did at McDonald's, because animal welfare, it wasn't on the map for our suppliers. It was not a core tenet back in the 80s and 90s. It was kind of a haphazard, and it wasn't strategic. It wasn't built in. So we put it on the map. It became global. Basically, almost all the other retailers adopted similar programs. And, we did all this without spending a whole lot of money more. Most of the changes were training. It was a mindset. It was getting it into operational concerns. We did make some investments in terms of obviously, if you're going to have more room for housing, laying hens and sows, you're going to be spending a little bit more money. But we led, we made changes. We ultimately, many of these changes became the new floor, the new kind of dynamic. So we weren't at any competitive disadvantage. And, we went from, again, being on the defensive into being in a place where now we could stand up, and when PETA was doing all their attacks, we could just keep them where they belong, which is on the fringes, and say, well, here's our strategy. Here's what we're doing. If you want to know what's going on, why don't you talk to Dr. Temple Grandin or talk to the other scientists on our Animal Welfare Council? They'd be glad to tell you what we're doing. Are they going to believe, is the public going to believe, is the media going to believe Bob Langert saying that we do a good job in animal welfare? I don't know. I'm just a corporate suit, right? But at the end of the day, they are going to believe Dr. Temple Grandin. So, I just can't tell you what a pleasure it was to work with her, and the idea of finding organizations that can make these types of changes. It's just so important. And again, she touted our work publicly, and this is worth so much money for us, really, in terms of making us look good, being proactive, and improving how consumers see us. Let me move to the third battle that we had, and this one is the battle of I'll call it junk food. And maybe many of you saw the Super Size Me movie, which it's a full throttle attack on the very essence of McDonald's. And this one, I wanted to talk about this one because this might be the most germane to the audience here. And what I mean by this was packaging and even animal welfare. I wouldn't call that core to McDonald's, but certainly if they're going to attack our food, that's what we sell. Just like horses are what you have. So to me, this was the biggest and most vulnerable and most important attack on McDonald's. Back when the U.S. Surgeon General came out with a report in 2002, basically declaring an obesity epidemic, and McDonald's became the lightning rod for this issue, along with some other companies like Coke. And this one was a really tough one for us. And believe it or not, my boss told me I ended up heading our nutrition task force for McDonald's for about 5 years. So I was right in the middle of this issue, trying to come up with solutions. And we were looking for the same environmental defense fund, Dr. Temple Grandin. We're looking for the same formula here, but we struggled to get it. And we were consistently attacked. Our brand suffered a lot. And can you believe that only 29% of our consumers during this whole time of the 2000s, and even after that, only 29% of our consumers felt good about eating our food. And almost all those factors about not feeling good were related to sustainability issues, whether it's obesity, ethics, care for animals, all that bled into this poor food, junk food, perception. We made many changes to make our food healthier. And without going into detail, I can tell you that none of them worked. The consumer just didn't see McDonald's as one selling healthier food. They wanted to come to McDonald's for hamburgers and fries and shakes and more indulgent food. Finally, we partnered with the Alliance for a Healthier Generation. They're another NGO. modeled after the ones I just talked about, modeled after advocates for health, but willing to work with corporations to make a difference. And they told us the biggest thing we can do for responsibility for McDonald's is that you can do more for kids. You know, adults eat the way they do, they're adults, they make their own choices for food, but kids, that's a big part of our business, the family business. You can do more. So that's when we made this huge announcement, and I think it's probably the best thing we ever did. I don't think most people, you know, give us that much credit for it, but I'm very proud that we made our Happy Meal different in 2011. We downsized the fry to 100 calories. We took soda off the menu board, said it's either, you know, milk or juice. A yogurt or a fruit would always come along with the meal. We reduced the calorie count. And by the way, it was just a win-win again. You know, winning the public, sales turned around and got better, and our reputation on food became better. So it's a great example of taking an issue head on. And in this case, very much getting license to continue selling our food to families. I am convinced that if we didn't do this, we'd still be suffering today. So we followed that same formula, and it worked. And you can see that their leadership praised the work of McDonald's. Again, praise like this is hard fought, hard earned, based on collaborating, being open, and getting stuff done. That's the formula. Now, here's my report card, though. I just told you 3 stories of success, really. I mean, we did good. We reduced waste. We changed the animal welfare sentiment with our suppliers. We made our food healthier for kids. But you know what? That gave us an A for crisis management. We were really good at, once an issue became volatile, became in the public domain, we were really good at solving it. And so we get an A for that. But you know what? It didn't do us much good. By the way, our scores for how consumers felt about us up until 2024, even though we did all this good work, by the way, nobody knew about it. We hardly talked about it. All these issues were not strategic. We get an F there. They're all one-offs. They're all peripheral. We did it. We moved on. I talked about, we measured brand health. That's what we called it. We had 42 different attributes that we measured for brand health. And I already told you that half those attributes are long-term brand attributes that have to do with sustainability. We were horrible. We had orange, we had red, yellow, and green as our indicators, and all of our scores were red for those 22 attributes. People didn't believe we cared. And lastly, we were an F in communication. We were in denial. When people attacked us, we were defensive. We blamed others. We didn't want to communicate. We're going to open up Pandora's box if we communicate more. We weren't acknowledging the issue. I heard earlier that you need to acknowledge the issue. It's like our lawyers, and you know, I can't say that lawyers were my best friends at McDonald's. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But our lawyers wouldn't even allow us to say that there's an obesity problem in the world. Yeah, and so when you're strapped down like that, you know, are people going to believe you? You know, I don't think so. But finally, in 2000, and oh, by the way, that date should have been, that's wrong there. It should be 2014. So finally, in 2014, we learned our lesson. And the new CEO said, you know what? I'm no longer going to we're no longer going to be on our back foot. We're no longer going to let the activists define our strategy. So we went from being reactive to proactive. This slide, I used a lot at McDonald's. I think it's a slide that your industry could use a lot. You do not want to live on the right side of this slide. You do not want to wait for issues to become public, for the politicians to get involved, the media. you want to look at issues on the left side of this curve when you could actually make changes that make sense in your business. So we ended up changing things in 2014. This was our nirvana. This was a dream come true for me. These two slides I'll show you went to our board of directors, and very important to realize we went from being scattered, not getting credit, to recognizing that all these things are not just nice to do, they can actually grow our business. We can be focused, we can make a difference, and we can grow our business, and we can get credit. And we became passionate and believed in this idea that there is the overlap of societal issues in our business. We can actually grow our business. We no longer feared the space, and we were fearful of it before. Now we saw it as an opportunity. Total mind shift. And to tell you a story about this mind shift, we actually created sustainable beef. And I don't have time to get into the details of this, but we asked the leading experts around the world, what's the one thing you would do as a CEO if you were given one day of running our business? Almost all of them said sustainable beef. So we started a sustainable beef initiative, not even knowing what it meant. And to think that we did that is amazing. And so we formed a global roundtable for sustainable beef, which again is very important to be collaborative and bring all different aspects of the supply chain, the value chain together. And we have developed standards and measures for this process. And nobody was attacking us for sustainable beef. This is our idea of being proactive and addressing issues that can help society and run our business. So I want to close with the 4 tips that I've talked about. And one is this slide here, being open book, being open. And please go back to my presentation. Hopefully they'll share it with you and read through what all these things mean. I would say of all the things I'm recommending, this is the hardest thing for organizations to do. They're just afraid to be open. But if you hide things, you know what people are going to think? You're hiding things. You're doing things that are wrong. Secondly, work with your critics, work with scientists, because if you look at this slide closely, who do people believe? By the way, global companies, which McDonald's is, we had a negative perception factor. People are going to believe scientists and NGOs. So find those that can help you forward with what you're trying to do. Thirdly, I just show this slide because you got to get stuff done. You got to have proof points. And by the way, don't worry about being perfect. The reality is you're always going to be imperfect. You're always going to be falling short. There's always more to be done. So there's a sense of humbleness that you need to say that here's the things that we're doing. Here's what we're successful at. But if you don't share what you're not successful at, people aren't going to believe you. So that's a big step that I'm asking you to consider. And lastly, this is my favorite quote. It came from our president that changed to Happy Meal. She said, let's fix the hole in the roof while the sun is shining. So don't do what McDonald's did. Don't wait 25 years to be strategic. Do it now. Do it sooner versus later. So thank you for inviting me. Really was looking forward to sharing these lessons learned, and I look forward to talking more during the Q&A.
Bob, thank you so much for that. A fascinating insight and so many extraordinary statistics you came up with during the course of that presentation that will be great to explore. So moving on then, following Bob, I'm delighted to introduce Charlie Arnott. And Charlie has more than 25 years of experience working in communications, public relations, and issues management within the food and agricultural industry. He is founder and president of Jockey, a consulting firm that aims to grow trust by improving the conversation about how food is raised, grown, processed, sold, prepared, and eaten. Charlie also serves as chief executive of the Centre for Food Integrity, an international non-profit organisation dedicated to building consumer trust and confidence in today's food system. Today, he will talk about values-based communication and actions, evidence from agriculture. Charlie, the floor is yours.
Roly, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. This is a terrific conversation, and it's an honor to follow such a distinguished group of speakers and hope I can contribute something to the conversation that will be of value. Just a bit more background. I grew up raising and showing quarter horses, so I have an appreciation for equine and equestrian, those who are involved in the equestrian pursuit. I also spent 10 years as a corporate officer for a large pork integrator. And during that period of time, we relied on 3 strategies to defend our position. We talked a lot about science, we talked about our economic interests and what we contributed to society, and we attacked those who attacked us. And what I will share with you is that strategy is not effective. And so 20 years ago, I left that organization to found an organization focused on building trust as opposed to defending a position. And if you decide you're going to focus on building trust as opposed to defending an interest, you'll engage in very different strategies. And so I'll share with you some of those trust building strategies today and really how they impact social license and ultimately your freedom to operate. It's been our privilege over the last 3 years or so to support companies like Walmart and Costco and Starbucks and Kroger in revising and updating their animal welfare policies. So we have a lot of insight into the commercial implications for animal welfare, the interest of consumers, the interest of society, and as it applies to animal agriculture and kind of the history and journey that we've been on, much of what will reflect the journey that McDonald's was on as well, but in a somewhat broader context. So let me begin by establishing kind of a fundamental foundation, which is going to be fairly familiar or rudimentary, but I'll explain why this foundation is so important. And that's the distinction and the evolution of animal rights versus animal welfare. Animal welfare is something that we're all committed to, making sure that the animals in our care are well cared for. We acknowledge that we have an ethical obligation to provide care for those animals that are in our charge, whether they're producing food or therefore recreation. That's distinct from animal rights, where there is a belief among the animal rights community that animal rights have moral worth and should be free to live free rather from human exploitation, that they are sentient beings and should be having the same rights as humans. And in animal agriculture, we tended to get fixated on the 2 poles, the polar ends where animals are believed to be property and should be treated as such, or that animals are sentient beings and should be granted the same rights as human species. Now, very few people are going to be reading books to their chickens, and very few people are going to be treating animals as property. But we tended to get fixated on the 2 poles as opposed to recognizing the concerned and conflicted majority was where we should have been spending our time having the conversation and understanding the evolving social values as it relates to animals. So we asked the question, are animals companions, competitors, or food? And the answer, of course, is yes to all 3. Depending on the circumstances and the cultural norms, they can be companions, they can be competitors, and they can be food. But the challenge right now that we see is that because animals play such different roles in different societies, that creates cognitive dissonance, especially for those whose primary relationship with animals is as a companion. And we see more and more people, their only relationship is with animals as companions. And so they become conflicted. And then that discomfort and anxiety they have about the different roles that animals play in society allows their compassion, their understandable compassion for animals, to be exploited by others. And then our historical response is to be very defensive. So what we really want to focus on is that rational majority in the middle of the bell curve. This group simply wants permission to believe that you're operating in a manner consistent with their values and broad social norms. Now, those values and social norms are evolving. And we need to understand and appreciate that those values and norms are evolving. But as Temple Grandin once told me, if you're focusing on anybody who's more than 1 or 2 standard deviations from the mean, you're wasting your time. So it really is understanding who is in that rational majority that is somewhat concerned and conflicted about the role of animals in society, and how do we engage with them in a way that gives them that permission to believe that we're operating in a way consistent with broad social expectations. Now, Bob showed you the issues management curve. It's a great model to be able to talk about how we work in the emergence phase rather than a reactive phase after there's a triggering event. But what we saw in animal agriculture for the first decade that I was involved was a very defensive issues management approach. First of all, we're going to delay and hope it goes away. People aren't going to pay attention to these activists. They're just banging a noisy gong. We can ignore them. And if we ignore them long enough, hopefully they'll just go away because we don't know what else to do. Secondly, and this was a very prevalent approach, we're going to rely on science. And if that doesn't work, we're going to get more science. And if that doesn't work, we're going to do it again. Because we operated under the assumption that there was a magic combination of data or science or research that would ultimately be convincing to the public, and they would come to our side of the argument. And the belief was, if we haven't been able to get the public to come to our side of the argument, it must mean we don't yet have that magic combination of data. So let's do some more research. And we repeated that process over and over and over again, believing that the solution was going to be data-driven. We talked about our economic impact, focusing primarily on our sector, right? We create this many jobs, we pay this much in taxes, we create these opportunities for economic development, and here's our economic impact. So you should just leave us alone and be pleased with what we do, right? Because we create jobs and we return an economic impact to society. And then finally, we attacked those who attacked us. That was the response. And we'll talk about how that actually worked against the industry over time, because what we found was a fairly significant misalignment with that group in the middle of the bell curve that was looking for us to operate in a way consistent with broad social norms and social values. So we'll talk about why this historical defensive issues management approach did not work for animal agriculture, and in all likelihood is not likely to work for you as well. And then finally, if it wasn't our sector, we just kept our head down. Well, they're focused on cattle right now, so let's not talk about it because we're in the pig business. Well, they're focused on pigs right now, so let's not talk about it because we're in the chicken business. And so we just didn't want to raise the profile of the issue or engage in the conversation for fear that doing so would then put us in the crosshairs of the activists. And so we repeated this process over and over and over again, and we got the same result. Where we were misaligned with public expectations, we continue to see trust erode. And when trust erodes, your social license and your freedom to operate is eroded as well. So we know that science is essential to building trust, but it's not sufficient. So please don't misunderstand. I am not in any way saying that science isn't important. Science is important. We have to have the science to be providing the proof points and the validation for the claims that we're making and our ability to demonstrate progress, but it's not sufficient to build trust. So what do we think about as we go forward? I'm going to talk first about an important inflection point that really began to turn the tide in animal agriculture. And it happened back in 2008, February 17th, where Hallmark Westland, it was a meatpacking plant, a beef plant in California, had a record recall of 143 million pounds of raw and frozen beef. It was by far the largest recall in the history of the United States. Now, it was triggered by an undercover video that was released by the Humane Society of the United States that showed non-ambulatory animals, or what the industry referred to as downers, being pushed by forklifts, dragged with chains as they were being moved to slaughter. And the images were horrific, absolutely horrific, as you saw these non-ambulatory animals clearly being mistreated in a very cruel way because they weren't able to move. And the treatment for non-ambulatory animals is to euthanize them, not to move them into slaughter using some kind of mechanization that was going to be obviously very inconsistent with social standards and clearly cruel and inflicting a great deal of pain to the animal. So Hallmark Westland at the time was also an approved supplier to the school lunch program. So it was no accident that the Humane Society of the United States targeted this plant because they saw the connection to the school lunch program and the connection now to food safety. So it was very, very interesting because the recall was a food safety recall. But what happened, and this is where there was the horrific misalignment between social values and the industry response, the industry engaged in a very dramatic and public debate about whether there was a food safety risk, while the public was understandably outraged by the animal abuse that they saw on the video. So this truly became an inflection point where the industry began to recognize we are fundamentally misaligned with social expectations, because this triggered the massive recall and changed USDA processes and USDA regulations for how non-ambulatory animals would be treated, and whether non-ambulatory animals could go into the food system. So the complete loss of social license, the implementation of greater social control in a change in regulation about whether or not non-ambulatory animals could even enter the food system. Now, was it a food safety risk or was it not a food safety risk? The industry debated that technical point when the rest of the country was watching these videos going, we are horrified by what we saw. We are outraged at the abuse of these animals, and you're not even talking about that. What you're debating is the scientific merits of whether or not this is a food safety risk. So completely tone deaf in terms of the industry response and the industry approach to not recognizing the fact that they were in fact very misaligned with public expectations at that point in time. So ultimately, Hallmark Westland filed bankruptcy due to the cost of the recall and subsequent litigation. But what it did, it also emboldened the activist community to realize the power of video, and they expanded their undercover work and began releasing a larger number of undercover videos. Now, ultimately, the industry began to appreciate the tone-deaf response that they had and recognize that they needed to embrace a very different approach. So what happened over time with the release of an undercover video was the industry began to be the first voice responding to that, saying what we saw there was horrific and fundamentally inconsistent with the standards and the expectations we have for our industry. We look forward to working with Farmer Jones, Farmer Smith, whoever it happens to be, to help him or her come back into compliance with the high standards we've established. So it began to help the industry understand how can we respond to these issues in a way that is better aligned with public expectation, where we can condemn what happened without condemning the farmer. We can condemn the outcome. We can condemn that particular situation without condemning the producer or the packer. Also, what we saw was the restaurant and the retail industry become more sophisticated in their responses, where historically they would have said, we're going to ban this producer, we're going to ban this packer from our supply chain. They modified that approach to say, we're going to suspend temporarily this specific farm or this specific operation while we better understand what took place. So over time, collectively, the U.S. livestock sector and those who the restaurants who relied on them began to understand there is a better approach where we can demonstrate we're aligned with social expectations and still call out bad actors and call out actions that are fundamentally inconsistent with social expectations. So it's important to understand today that we're competing for share of heart, mind, and voice in this conversation. Now, historically, we've been very good in the rational component of this equation. We have data, we have science, we can talk about the data, we can talk about the science, we can talk about our research, we can talk about our reports. But we need to understand today, we are also competing in the social conversation, and we're competing for the emotional resonance of messages that will help people have confidence that we're doing the right thing. So that's kind of where we've been, and it can lead to kind of wondering, what in the world do we do now? So we're going to spend the rest of my time talking about what is the approach we can take to continue to build trust and earn social license, because it is all about trust. Trust is the fundamental asset we have to continue to earn and protect over time. And I want everybody here to appreciate that trust is not altruism, right? It certainly is doing the right thing, but more importantly, it's enlightened self-interest. Because when you're focused on building trust, you embrace the evolution of consumer expectations, which are always changing. You realize that anybody who has this has access to unlimited information at a moment's notice. There's a demand for greater transparency, as Bob noted, because people expect to be able to find the information that's relevant to them. And if you're not transparent, it implies you have something to hide. And there are growing animal welfare concerns by consumers, food companies, influencers, policymakers, and other stakeholders. So building trust is truly in your long-term best interest. We would argue that trust is every organization's most valuable intangible asset. Clearly, the former owners of Hallmark Westland would agree, but other organizations where trust has been lost or eroded also have painful examples of the real value of trust. So let's talk about what it takes to earn and maintain that social license. Really, what you want to be able to do in the equestrian world is maintain your freedom to operate, the ability to do what you do best with a minimum amount of outside interference. As you've talked about really since the very beginning, from Roly's presentation, from Ingmar's presentation, is that's all based on maintaining social license. Now, social license is really on the other side of social control. What we saw at Hallmark Westland was the tipping point, right? So they saw that clear tipping point and they moved from social license to social control. It was also referenced, I believe, in Ingmar's presentation, that social license is a shared asset, and you are only as good as the weakest link. So what we saw in Hallmark Westland was the violation they had of social license changed the procurement practices and changed the ability of the cattle industry to bring non-ambulatory animals to market for the entire sector, right? So that one bad actor reduced the social license, and we saw social control imposed because of that one incident. So it's important to understand the value of self-regulation and helping people understand the importance of operating in a way consistent with the ethics and values of society. Because if one doesn't, then you violate the social license, you cross that tipping point, and then you see social control. And it can certainly come in regulation or legislation, but today it's more likely to come from the market, where the marketplace simply says, we're not going to accept that any longer. It's inconsistent with our brand. We're not taking the brand risk because you made a mistake. And so whether it comes from legislation or regulation, social control can be imposed through a number of different ways. So social license is based on trust. So we really wanted to understand from a research standpoint what drives trust. So we looked at 23 different pieces of research and we identified 3 primary drivers. The first is the role of influential others. Now that used to be exclusively credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. Today, those influential others can just as easily be a social media influencer who has a large following on TikTok or Instagram or other, who has no credential, has no expertise, but still has a lot of influence because they've made a connection with that particular audience. The second element in building trust is competency. That's our technical capacity in science. And again, that's historically where we've hung our hat, right? We've counted on competency and science and data being the be-all, end-all to building trust. The third element in building trust is confidence, the perception of shared values. Can I count on you to do what's right as I define it? So once we identified those 3 elements, we surveyed 6,000 US consumers over 3 years, asking them questions about sustainability, animal welfare, food safety, et cetera. And what we found was that shared values are 3 to 5 times more important in building trust than demonstrating competency. So again, science is essential, but it's not sufficient because shared values are the primary driver for building trust. And if it appears that your values are misaligned with those stakeholders who control social license, they will impose more social control. So your social license is really dependent on your ability to demonstrate you share the values of those who influence social license. So it kind of goes back to the quote from former US President Theodore Roosevelt, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So it's about demonstrating that care and commitment first, and then providing the science to support it. So in the last few minutes here, let's transition and talk about your critical role and the path to successful engagement. Because we have a model, we've done engagement training in North America, South America, Europe, Southeast Asia. We've done this training in 5 different languages with thousands of people across the globe to help them understand, what does values-based engagement include? How do we successfully engage in a way that helps stakeholders understand our commitment to the values that are aligned with broad social expectations? Because that's the key to social license and freedom to operate. So let's start by the building blocks for technical messages, because oftentimes we do have a technical message to communicate. We know there are 4 components to a technical message: the unifying message, being open and transparent, the accurate presentation of risk, and then leveraging those trusted sources, whether they're scientists, in your case, veterinarians, or perhaps social media influencers as well. So what might that sound like, right? A unifying message, the singular, compelling message that touches the values, right? Well, horses are natural athletes. We understand our obligation to protect them and to make sure their well-being is cared for, regardless of their competition and regardless of how we are partnering with them in competition. Openness and transparency. Acknowledge both sides of the story, provide that level of depth so it doesn't look like you're holding back, and the accurate presentation of risks, right? So like any athlete, there's always the potential for injury. So we take that potential for injury into consideration, and that's why we follow these steps to prevent the likelihood of injury while these athletes are competing, and to make sure we can treat them if an injury does occur. And then the trusted sources. Who are the trusted sources for those stakeholders who control your social license? They're likely to be veterinarians. They're likely to be others who have an ethical obligation to make sure animals are well cared for, not those necessarily who have an economic interest in the animal's well-being. So we want to talk about 3 things to stop doing and 3 things to start doing. We frequently work with a lot of technical audiences, and one of the challenges you have as a technical person is you know way too much. And so again, we want to communicate that knowledge, believing that if we can help people understand what we know, they'll clearly believe what we believe. But there's a difference between belief and knowledge, right? What we want to do is give them that permission to believe, not necessarily to know what we know, because we're not going to convince them by sharing more facts and data. So 3 things to stop doing as you begin this conversation and engaging more successfully. First, stop trying to persuade, right? You can acknowledge people's concern without validating misinformation, right? Boy, from your comment, I can tell you care very deeply about horse welfare. And I really respect that and appreciate it, because I care very deeply about it too. So don't start by persuading them. Stop doing that, because you're not going to convince somebody with data. Stop correcting, because if they have misinformation, again, you're not going to help them. You're not going to increase their belief by correcting them. And then finally, stop trying to win. This is a challenge, and I frequently run into people in animal agriculture who says, well, I feel good about that because I won the argument. Well, good for you, because you just alienated someone else, right? You're not there to win the argument. You're there to win support. You're there to encourage belief that you're doing the right thing and what you're doing is aligned with broader social values. So what are the 3 things you need to start doing? And the best part about this is you already have everything you need to be successful. Who you are is more important than what you know. Let me repeat that, because it's a key take home from this presentation. Who you are is more important than what you know. Your ability to connect as a person, your ability to connect as someone who cares deeply about animals, your ability to connect with someone who loves the equestrian lifestyle and who loves horses, is much more important than the technical information that you have to share. So here are 3 things you can absolutely begin to start doing. First of all, it begins with listening. Now, when I was working in the pork industry, I knew the likely concerns that people were going to raise. So when I began to listen, I immediately began thinking about my response, right? That's what I was listening for was, oh, they're going to attack us on the environment. They're going to attack us on animal housing. They're going to attack us on meat quality, whatever it happens to be. And here are my data points. So I began to listen to respond, not listening for their shared values. So it begins by listening without judgment. That's hard to do. It's a skill that has to be practiced, because you're listening to find that shared value, that place where you can connect with someone as a person, not as an opponent. The other thing that I will say is we also make a distinction between those who are reformers and those who are abolitionists. And we'll talk about the importance between those 2 groups as we continue to move forward. And it's going to be important for you to also understand that as you're listening without judgment, you're going to have to listen with a very neutral or engaging posture, right? So no arms crossed, no shaking your head. You might have to teach your face to use its inside voice, because there are going to be times you want to respond with, you've got to be kidding me, right? And you need to suppress that urge, because really what you want to do is invite dialogue, not correct the individual with whom you are engaging. So let's assume that Roly and I are going on a hike, okay? Just for the sake of this illustration. Roly and I are going to go on a hike, and we're going to go to the very top of that mountain. We're looking forward to it. We've planned for it for a great deal of time. We get to the very peak, and we're standing there at the top of the mountain at the very peak, back to back. And I ask Roly what he sees, and he says, well, I see this fantastic valley with this beautiful river. And it might be delightful to kayak down that river. We might go fishing in that river. It would just be a great place to go. Maybe we should take our next hike to the river. And I'm looking where I'm staying, and I'm saying, that's not what I see at all. What I see is a bustling port city where there's a lot of activity and there are a lot of boats and people coming and there's commercial activity. It might be really interesting to go down and better understand the culture of what's going on in that community and perhaps grab a quick meal together. And we're standing in the exact same position, but we'll see very different things. So no matter our view, our experience is true. So the person who comes to you with questions or concerns about the equestrian world or the competition of horses, whether it's racing or other jumping, whatever it happens to be, their experience is as true to them as your experience is to you. So it's important to validate that experience, again, without validating misinformation, to understand that their experience and their worldview is as valid to them as yours is to you. So we want to come into that conversation with respect for that perspective and the opportunity to learn from each other and engage in a fundamentally different way. The second step in our three-step process is to ask, right? So you begin by listening without judgment, and then you ask, but you're asking to invite dialogue, clarify, better understand, and to show you care. So if someone comes and says, you know, I just think I've seen the horses jump, I've seen the steeplechase, I just think it's cruel because horses can be injured, it seems like they're being exploited. Well, you can invite dialogue. That's really interesting. I appreciate your perspective. I can tell you care about horses. Tell me more about what it is that your specific concerns might be. So you're trying to engage them in dialogue to demonstrate that you care, to better understand their perspective, and to get to the next step where you are finally given the opportunity to share. But you're only given that opportunity to share after you've listened and asked and listened and asked and listened and asked 3 times, right? So you want to engage in this conversation because what you're looking for, as you see the Venn diagram there with the conversation bubbles, is that shared value. And oftentimes that shared value is a commitment to animal well-being, that you care a great deal about horse welfare and horse well-being, and so do they. So now you've got the opportunity to engage. You've got the opportunity to share more about what's being done to protect animal welfare, to care for animals that may be injured during competition, to make sure that animals are raised and cared for after their competition life, their life in competition is completed, and to address whatever concerns they may have. And in doing so, you may not give them information that they take home, but what you might do is to help them understand your commitment to do what's right and to operate in a way consistent with social expectations, which then grants you social license. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. I might be done a minute or two early, but start by practicing. It doesn't make perfect, but it helps. So if you have the opportunity to engage, think about that, right? I think the best compliment I ever had was when we were doing this in Geneva one time, and we were done with the training, and the young woman came up and she said, finally, I know how to connect with my mother-in-law, right? So if you can connect with your in-laws, if this training can help you do that, clearly it'll be able to help you connect with others who raise concerns. But again, it's listen, ask, listen, ask, listen, ask, share. It's not beginning by disputing facts, by providing more information. It's about engaging that conversation to help them understand your commitment to do what's right, and in such a way to help them grant you the social license to move forward. It's also important to remember the mountain, right? That Roly and I went up, and this is where we get the distinction between abolitionists and reformers. You want to make sure you try not to push anyone off the mountain. So if you run into someone, and it happens from time to time, where you simply cannot make a connection, right? If you run into an abolitionist as to a reformer, simply acknowledge that you're not going to be able to reach a consensus. You're not going to be able to reach a place where you can have agreement, and walk away from the conversation, because you're not going to convince that person. But what you want to make sure you do is have others who may be watching or listening see that you treat everyone with respect, and that you're willing to listen to conversations and you're willing to listen to criticism. Because again, even in those conversations, you're helping to influence others to help them understand your commitment to doing what's right and operating in a way with broad, consistent social values. And lastly, again, you have everything you need. Who you are is more important than what you know. It's about connecting on values, because consumers and other stakeholders need your expertise, they need your insight, but they also need you to build a relationship with them so they grant you the social license. That's the end of my formal presentation. I look forward to the question and answers, and I will turn it back over to you, Roly.
Charlie, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating presentation and so many bits about the difference between knowledge and belief. there was lots to unpick there. And as Charlie's just mentioned, we're going to come back after a short break and we'll have 2 more presentations. So I'm now delighted to move on to our next speaker, who is Kieran Moffat. Kieran is a social scientist who has maximised the impact of his scientific work by founding the company Equestrianism. Equestrianism uses engagement science to help companies and industries improve their social performance and harness the relationship mechanisms that underpin social license to operate. Over the last 15 years, Kieran has worked across a broad range of industries in more than 20 countries, using quantitative social psychological research methods to reveal the pathways to deeper community trust for companies and industries, and to provide a voice for community members for making decisions that affect their lives. Today, he will talk about engagement science, a data-driven approach to social license. Kieran.
Great, thanks, Roly, and g'day everybody. Apologies for the short sleeves. It's 25 degrees here at midnight in Brisbane, so I'm dressing down. What I'm really looking forward to sharing with you today is some of the insights that we've been able to draw from that work that Roly spoke to there, and in particular to try and pick out those universal features of strong, mature relationships that underpin a positive social license, and share with you some of the stories and experiences we've had across multiple industries in different places. Now I'm a social and organizational psychologist by training, and so I'll be speaking to social license through that lens. That was research that we conducted in CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, and then rolled out to form a company 5 years ago. Now, universally, what we've seen is that community expectations have and are increasing about the way that industries and companies operate and do their work. And for lots of those industries and companies, it's really hard out there. We have, I think, as some of the other speakers have outlined, often outdated ways of engaging communities, of addressing conflict, of seeking to build relationships and consensus, and to enable that freedom to operate that Charlie was talking about so eloquently. And I would say that they haven't always been outdated. In fact, they've been very effective for many years. But as those community expectations have changed, have shifted, have increased, less and less effective are they in managing social risk for those companies and industries. And what we found in this work across time is that when communities don't have constructive ways to be heard, when they can't have that voice inside the decision spaces that influence materially their lives, they will find creative ways to influence companies and industries. And what you can see on that image there is one very creative way that a farmer in Victoria was able to express his discontent with the way a renewable energy infrastructure developer was conducting their activities. And that's a really interesting industry where it shares a landscape with industries that have managed these issues for decades, like mining, but also agriculture, which has done the same in different ways, particularly in countries like Australia, a really overlay of different industries in these spaces. And that industry in particular made the mistake of thinking that the global good attached to renewable transition in this country would buy them goodwill and currency within those local communities. In fact, for local communities, it might as well be an open-cut coal mine. It's a huge disruption to build these large infrastructure elements across the landscape, and in fact, building those transmission towers on properties where families and individuals are experiencing energy poverty. So literally building the energy network of the future across the top of their property while they're unable to get reliable power energy themselves, has led to real crisis of social license within that industry in many parts of this country. And what we've found since the 90s, when this really became a critical issue for many industries, is it's no longer enough to have a legal license to operate. Communities require something more, and it's often said that that companies are looking to make a deal, where communities are looking to build a relationship. And what we've seen is that whether that's at local scales with companies operating in local contexts like AusNet here, or at national scales with industry seeking to garner support and build social license with populations, that those conditions are dynamic. The criteria, the conditions for acceptance are dynamic and change and are negotiated continuously. So the social license concept, I think, is incredibly powerful. This is a definition that we used in a paper published in 2014. And why I like it is that it really speaks to the breadth of those that can influence your freedom to operate as a company or an industry. But it's about those community members that are directly affected or feel they have a direct stake or are impacted by what you're doing, but also picks up on the very real fact that there are stakeholders beyond that immediate circle that can affect your profitability or freedom to operate, or whatever it is that's important to you as an industry. And for us to, what we saw early on in this work is that the biggest risk for an industry is to assume that you have a social license to operate, that because you are operating, that you have a social license. And our first piece of work was, in fact, to in this program of research in CSIRO, was to do an analysis of the way mining companies talked about social license as a concept. And overwhelmingly, they spoke with this assumption that they had one and it was theirs to lose rather than for community to grant. But what is a social license in practice? Well, it's for me, what I think is often not discussed in the context of social license is the general imbalance of power between the groups that are involved in that negotiation of social license. And that's where that creativity comes into play, where a voice is not present, where community are not able to speak into the decisions that affect them, or to speak about the issues that they consider important to them. And the other side of that, which is vulnerability. Managing the vulnerability of community members, whether that's vulnerability living around a mine site and being impacted by blasting, or impacts on water quality through discharge from a mining operation, through to a sense of inferred vulnerability around animals and livestock in rural industries. Managing that vulnerability, understanding it and getting inside it is actually really critical to understanding social license. And what does it look like to lose it? Well, we've got a clear picture here behind this slide, which is a mining protest in Peru that turned violent, and as they do often in Latin America and parts of Africa, where there's a storied history of quite extreme reactions and responses from community who are really fed up with feeling like companies and governments are riding roughshod over their interests, their vulnerabilities, in the pursuit of gains that they aren't able to share in. And in terms of what it looks like to lose, what is the cost of losing social license or experiencing social rejection? We've got some really quite solid numbers around this, in fact. So, in mining, a shutdown costs about $36 million US a day in lost revenues, productivity for a mining operation. Renewables infrastructure in Australia, there's an estimate by AEMO, our national regulator, around energy generation, that a 1-year delay to the optimal development pathway of renewable infrastructure transmission infrastructure leads to a $12.5 billion cost. And just for some scale, that optimal development pathway relates to only 5 projects that are critical to the backbone infrastructure required for the transition to renewables in Australia. And it can even be existential. So the live export industry in New Zealand was shut down by that government, not based on anything really other than ideology, and being influenced by those that very vehemently and actively campaign against that. And in Australia, we have a similar situation where the current government is committed to banning the live export industry. And in fact, the live export industry here has already experienced a moratorium for a year or two a few years ago. So I'll be revisiting some work we've been doing with the live export industry in Australia a little later on in a case study. So the costs of loss of social license are significant, and not least because it makes you uncompetitive also in the landscape in which most industries live. What we also see is it's making it more expensive and more difficult to access capital, and so we're seeing the alignment now of elements that are part of social license through the ESG agenda now overlapping with financial incentives and instruments like sustainability-linked loans that incentivize higher performance in sustainability type areas. So what we're seeing here is real cost associated with social rejection, and also incentives around the cost of capital for doing better in those spaces. So this isn't going away, and in fact, I think this is a key opportunity for industries and for companies to be embracing as these agendas become more embedded. All right, so I think it's worth revisiting the history of social license, actually, just to kind of kick us off to look at some data in this approach and how we approach the measurement of and then work on social license to operate with our customers. So social license is an imperfect metaphor. It was actually created by a mining executive in the mid-90s to help other mining executives to understand that their responsibilities as leaders in their companies extended beyond the legal license to operate, the conditions of their legal license to operate. And so it was really effective in helping them to see that, but really grew wings and took off. And there's a lot of criticism of the use of the term social license amongst those that care about such things. And some of that's well founded, but actually for me, much less interested in definitions than what social license is about, and helping communities to really influence those things that are important to them and build stronger, more productive relationships with those industries and companies that work alongside them. Now, in watching mining companies use the term social license in the early 2010, 2012. What we could see is that they were using it with real abandon, without a lot that sat behind it, and they were grouping all of their social sort of related activities under the banner of social license. And actually, we wanted to get in and blow the concept up, and so did some empirical research to test the theory of social license, such as it was at the time, by taking elements of social psychology that we could see applied very clearly to these intergroup relationships, as well as the way that social license itself was talked about in the literature. And what you can see on the right-hand side here is a stylized version of a path analysis, and I'll walk you through one of these a little bit later. But this is from our kind of first publication in this space, where we're able to really articulate empirically the recipe for building acceptance, our proxy for social license to operate, and also the central and critical role, as other speakers have said, of trust in that equation. and then some of those things on the left-hand side here that influence or drive trust and acceptance in social license. So that really gave us a sniff that in fact this is a powerful concept, something that we can in fact measure empirically, and in the traction we're able to get with mining companies and onshore gas companies, which is where we started this work in Australia, we were able to see that putting numbers to this concept was a great way for those in those companies who are engineers, the leaders of those companies, to feel like actually this wasn't some fluffy concept. This was something that had real rigor, that had real meaning, that they could then build KPIs around and track progress against. So we've done this work, as Roly said, in a whole bunch of different industries. And what we saw when we started to do this in different places, to kind of test this theory and to toughen it up and build it out, what we could see is that in fact what we needed to do is match the methods that we were using to the nature of the construct we were trying to observe. And what I mean by that is that social license, being such a dynamic concept, something that is negotiated in the day-to-day almost in some of the contexts where we operate, we needed to build a way of understanding how community sentiment changes in that dynamic way as well. And so we have multiple ways that we explore social license at different scales. So local voices is a version of this work that we do in a local context with mining companies, say, or renewable energy generation companies. And then First Voices, which is a version of that, but for First Nations peoples that we do in different countries. And then Citizen Voices, which is what we do with industries, where the rate of change is often less, is often slower. And so we're often collecting that data instead of quarterly or 3 or 4 times a year, as we do with local voices. We're collecting data annually to match that dynamism. What we also found in this work is that I can really relate to what Charlie was talking about before, is that we were presenting science to these companies, and we were talking to them about, empirically, here are the things that are really most important to your social license. But there was this big gap that we could see between those insights that we were providing and then being able to take meaningful action in those spaces. And so often that's about training those companies or industry members to be able to understand and interpret and translate insights into actions. But also what we find is that it's often about how do you support and prompt cultural change within those same companies and industries. That the real barrier to change is often that defensiveness around the way that others are talking about the industry that you belong to, and those things that are just really enduring as parts of culture. So in terms of pulling all of these things together, we're empirically understanding the nature of social license. We're building dynamic methods for measuring that across time, and then deploying tools to assist companies and industries to both understand and then work on themselves to apply those insights effectively. And in aggregate, we call that approach engagement science, where every part of that process is empirically validated. So science-driven to understand that actually, if we do this thing, we know from evidence that we're going to see this outcome from that activity. So I'm going to pick up a couple of case studies here and just sort of illustrate what this looks like in practice. And one that I thought that would be particularly applicable to this audience is a large collaborative research project that we do with Australian rural industries called the Community Trust in Rural Industries program here in Australia. And you can see here along the bottom, one of the key features of this work, which is that it's a collaboration between 11 research and development corporations, the National Farmers Federation, New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. So this is a complex governance structure, but a group of industries and other stakeholders that understand they have a shared challenge in this space. and that the time for throwing an industry under the bus so that you don't experience the impact of a particular incident needs to pass, that we need to work together in these spaces. This work is about conducting nationally representative surveys of the Australian population represented by age and gender, and also oversampling in rural areas, so we can really bring that regional voice into the conversation. And since 2019, over 4 surveys, we've collected 22,222 surveys, a nice round number there, and also collected data about specific industries within that as well. So driving deep into industries like grains and cotton, food and fibre, and then also working on outreach and extension and training of rural industries bodies in the application of the knowledge they're able to generate in this work. What we're trying to do in this work is 3 things. We're trying to understand what Australians in this case think. So what do they think about key issues related to rural industries? We're wanting to understand the change in those attitudes across time. And then thirdly, and probably most importantly, we're wanting to understand why they think that way. So in this process, we're doing large-scale surveys. We're trying to tap all of the interaction points that a community member has with rural industries, and all of those areas that they may have concerns about rural industries, identified through interviews and also desktop research. And then to answer that third question first, what we do is then conduct what we call path analysis, which is a really advanced statistical technique, very powerful technique that allows us to understand the relative importance of each of those issues or interaction points between community and rural industries in predicting trust and then acceptance. And what we've got here on the screen is another stylized path model from one of those years of research with rural industries. And I'm just going to explain what's going on here and then the story behind it. So what we have here on the right-hand side is acceptance, our proxy for social license to operate. It's a key outcome measure. And what you can see is that trust is sitting very centrally in this model. It doesn't sit centrally because we place it there. It sits there because this is the best fit of the model to the data. So trust sits centrally because it is a mediating variable. It is a vehicle that translates community experience and expectation of rural industries into their level of acceptance of rural industries. And what we do with those variables on the left-hand side is run this path analysis, effectively a competitive process that looks over and over again, thousands of iterations of modeling this data to find the optimal fit of the model to the data, to identify what are the strongest drivers of trust and acceptance. And in each of these boxes and circles are a number of questions from the survey and the data that sits behind that from those community members that we surveyed. So what we have here with rural industries is a really clear, clean story, which is that enduring over those 4 years to date, we've seen environmental responsibility as the strongest driver of trust and acceptance in this model, with 2 components. One is how do you manage your impacts effectively and the extent to which you're thinking about the future, so sustainability. The second strongest driver in this year's model, and that's elevated from past years, is animal welfare, and specifically the extent to which community members feel that farmers treat animals with dignity and respect. And our third strongest driver is procedural fairness, a really critical variable in all the work that we do, almost as important as trust. And that has 2 components also. One is that the more that community members feel that rural industries listen to their concerns, and the second component, the extent to which community members feel rural industries are willing to change their behaviour in response to their concerns, the more that they trust rural industries. And procedural fairness is a really important critical variable for other reasons too. It's strongly positively correlated with other features of this model and the other models where it appears, which means that if you are able to improve procedural fairness, demonstrate you're listening effectively, for example, then environmental responsibility ratings are also going to improve. So here we have this almost magical relationship that if you can demonstrate that you are wanting and seeking a mature relationship, you're going to actually affect attitudes on other critical features of your social license model. Okay, so that's effectively the recipe for social license. And then what we do is to track those key things across time and implement interventions to pull the levers in that model to influence trust and acceptance. What I wanted also to show here is that what we can do is to pick up on some of the background features in that relationship, in the broader environment that relationship lives in, that influences some of those things. So here we've got something that influences attitudes around environmental responsibility. And in the Australian context, that is appropriate use of water by rural industries. So that top left graph, what you can see, or what you're looking at here, is percentage agreement or strong agreement with the items that are labelled there. So these are items from the survey. And what we've seen since 2020 to 2023 is the proportion of people that agree or strongly agree that much of Australia is currently in drought has dropped by 20%. What we can also see is that's flowing on to influence the extent to which community members feel that rural industries are responsible users of water, and also that how much water is available for rural industries. So it's not just what industries are doing, but also the context in which they're operating. And for industries, it's really critical to understand those things, because you want to know what's in your control to influence and what is not in your control. And critically for this project, what we've also found consistently over time is that about 80% of Australians consider environmental management a shared responsibility among all rural industries. So really reconfirming that this is not something that individual industries, can be assigned, particularly around issues like water. Animal welfare is also an issue that's of critical importance from that modelling that we can see. And in fact, what we've seen in this data is that Australians have a more nuanced understanding of animal welfare. And you can see that 71%, that's increased by 2.3% over a couple of years. So that's statistically significant. That animal welfare in Australia is seen to be a complex issue. And that's important for an industry to understand, because often these are framed as black and white issues, as simplistic issues. That often frames the way industries engage the public on those issues. In fact, what this data is showing across time is that they're up for the conversation, the more complex conversation. So I think that's been really important within rural industries to help them in shaping their approach. Now, I mentioned also that we're working to help industries to apply these insights effectively, and through a scenario-based planning process, we use that model, those models, to help them to respond to an incident. So we confect an incident, and then we encourage them through a workshop to take on that model as a guide or as a recipe for building a tactical response and a strategic response. And when you know, in a couple of weeks after we ran that workshop with these industries, the grains industry had an overspray incident, and they rang me up and said, here's our response, and what do you think about it? And effectively, what they'd done is to build an immediate response that really emphasised procedural fairness. That we're listening to community, that we're acknowledging your concern. Here are the actions we're taking immediately to understand the issue, but also longer term, what are the things that we're going to commit to in terms of our research investment to understand these issues and how to avoid them in the future, but also in understanding more about strategically how we as an industry need to reflect on our way of thinking about how we manage overspray and issues related to that. So in this context, what we're able to see is that by embracing that recipe for social license, that empirical outline of what we need to be working on to influence social license, and then building practical capability within rural industries that we're able to see that applied in real time within an industry experiencing a critical issue. But just to finish off here, I just want to pick up on a couple of key features of the work today. What we've seen across industries, across time, and even across scales are several key features of social license that appear to be universal. One, as other speakers have said, is that trust is fundamental to social license. That is central in the relationship, and it has real pragmatic value within that relationship. It's not a fluffy nice to have. It has real utility within the relationship. It's the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. It's a resource to build, to trade in when you need to actually tackle something that's complex and difficult. What we also know is that procedural fairness is a critical part of social license as well, and a feature of a mature relationship that allows you to engage with conflict without burning the house down. So it's important that you can contest issues in constructive ways, to bring that voice of community into decision spaces where decisions are being made that affect them or that are important to them. We also know that the sister variable procedural fairness, distributional fairness, so the equitable distribution of benefit that flows from industries is also an important part of social license. And then also confidence in regulation. I didn't pick it up here, but that confidence in regulation is also really important. Other speakers have spoken to it. And that's because regulation is seen as a mechanism for managing that vulnerability of community members, both external to a company or an industry, but also the internal standards and mechanisms that companies use to ensure that they do the right thing. The higher the confidence within the public or community in that feature of the relationship, the higher the trust typically within a population. So thanks very much for your time, and again, also I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kieran. That was outstanding, and a different aspect of bringing that data to the fore in terms of engagement science, and lots of food for thought there. And I'm now delighted to move on to our final speaker today, which is Toby Park. And Toby leads the energy, environment and sustainability work at the Behavioural Insights team in the UK, an organisation that's often been referred to as the Nudge Unit. The Behavioural Insights team was the world's first government organisation dedicated to the application of behavioural science to policy problems. We've invited Toby to speak today because we recognise how important it is for all of us that we understand the science of human behaviour change, and that we are able to apply it to help equestrianism move forward on the path of sustainability. Toby's interests lie principally in the psychology of sustainable behaviour, and more broadly in applying behaviour science and rigorous evaluation methods to government policy. And he has led much of the BIT's team through thought leadership in the application of behavioural science to climate and the environment. Today, Toby's going to talk to us about enabling behaviour change within the equine sector. Toby.
Thank you so much, Roly, and good afternoon. Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. So let's first imagine I've offered to buy you a coffee and I offer you a choice of size, small, medium and large. Which would you like? Well, most people would tend to err towards the medium. Not everybody, of course. There's a distribution of preferences out there, but most people tend to err towards the medium. And if you ask people why, they tend to say, well, the small's a bit too small for me. The big's a bit too big, the medium is the right size. But if you then go ahead and do this and take away the small and introduce a bigger option and offer the new choice set, people tend to err towards the new medium, and you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's too small and the big's too big. The medium's the right size for me. But of course, the new medium was the old large. So what's going on here is that we're quite good at sort of overlaying these more rational, objective explanations on our own behavior, but we tend to be a little bit unaware of the extent to which our choices and our preferences and our actions and indeed our attitudes are being shaped in quite subtle but profound ways by the environment, the way in this case that the choice has been framed and presented to us. So these small changes to the environment, the way that choices are presented, the way that services are designed and so on, can have quite a big impact on our preferences and our actions. And really it's a sort of, I guess, a window and insight into how the brain works writ large. I think it's been quite nicely captured by the work of Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Laureate Prize in economics a number of years ago. He's a psychologist, but his very simple model that's been proposed by others before him is that our brain essentially operates on two systems, what he calls system 1, or fast thinking, and system 2, slow thinking. So system 1, if you were, say, driving a route you've done 1,000 times before. You would do it very much on autopilot. If I asked you what's 2 times 2, you could barely avoid the answer popping into your head. If I asked you to read out the color of that word, you would very quickly say red because it matches the text of the word. On the other hand, we do have, of course, a sort of capacity for more slow, deliberative, reflective thinking. If you're perhaps learning to drive, you've got to think about everything up front very carefully. If I was to then ask you to say the color of that word, it takes rather more concentration to say purple. So we have the capacity for both, and what I want to talk about today is a few different things. I'll come back to that model later, but I really want to sort of cover 2 things. So firstly, I want to, I guess, sort of entertain in the next 15 minutes or so 2 sets of ideas. So the first is that the general public, in this case, may be ignorant, perhaps allowing their sentimentality to excessively anthropomorphize horses and see problems of welfare where problems do not exist. And then the second idea is the opposite. So maybe the public critiques have a point. Maybe it's the equine sector that is stuck in its ways and tending to rationalize traditional or entrenched practices that should be exposed to a degree of scrutiny. So with luck, I will have offended everyone by the end of this presentation, but hopefully we'll have done so in a way that's fair. And I should also maybe on that point start with a brief caveat of humility. I know very little about horses or indeed the equine sector. So really I just want to present a few provocative but lightly posed thoughts and stick to what I do know a bit more about, which is the human psychology of this. So I'm essentially hoping that by highlighting some of the sort of behavioral quirks, some of the psychological acrobatics that tend to go on with these kind of issues, it might shed a useful light on some of this subject of conversation today. And then when I've done that, for the remaining sort of 10 minutes or so, towards the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk much more concretely about behavior change. So some of the techniques that we can use and adopt to encourage, whether it be within our industry or beyond, concrete changes in practices and behaviors. So let's start off with the public and their views. So firstly, we should acknowledge that the UK in particular, but this is certainly true in other parts of the world, love animals. Indeed, they also donate most to animal causes. So 69% of Brits claim that they're animal lovers. 8 in 10 say they have done something to help animals in the last 12 months. This here is some data from UK charitable donations, and animal welfare causes outstrip all other charitable donations in the UK. So why is this? Well, partly this is about this superpower that we as humans have. We have the ability to sense other people's thoughts, feelings, and intentions. It's what we call a theory of mind. That is to say, a capacity to understand other people by ascribing mental states to them, which we know may be different to our own. So in other words, we recognize that we're looking at another sentient being rather than living in a sort of narrow grip of our own beliefs and emotions at any moment in time. And as well as allowing us to negotiate or predict the behavior of other people and so on, that has also given us the power of empathy. And this power does not only translate to human beings. And in fact, the power of empathy that we have can be so powerful, it often causes us to sort of overstep the mark, meaning that we not only see faces, but emotions in non-living things. So, studies have even shown a tendency to ascribe an age or a gender to inanimate objects, as well as its emotional state. And people do feel a real sort of pang of empathy when they see these sorts of things. They're amusing at face value, but it does highlight something quite deep about our psychology. So, this also means we have preferences for certain emotional states in objects, and that's actually driving product design. So this particular study, for instance, has found that happy car designs are preferred over sad or aggressive faces, except notably amongst younger and sort of young to middle-aged men, which of course is why manufacturers tend to target different product designs and so on to different markets. So this sort of capacity for empathy that extends beyond ourselves is powerful. It's an important trait, of course, of human nature, but it does have a tendency to sort of perhaps go a little bit beyond its intended evolutionary remit. So we spoke a few moments ago of this sort of fast versus slow distinction in the way that we think and the way that our cognition works. And in the social domain, one of the ways that our fast brain operates is that it provides, in a sense, 2 heuristics or rules of thumb along which we quite instinctively categorize other people. So broadly along these two axes of competence and warmth or amiability. And our emotional state to them depends on this categorization. So for instance, if we detect warmth, but also incompetence, such as towards the elderly or the disabled, we tend to have a default emotional reaction of pity in that instance, whereas warmth but high competence would perhaps engender pride, or in this case, a degree of patriotism even. Among those we don't feel warmly towards, but recognize as highly competent, such as professionals or the wealthy, we might feel respect. So that might be towards pilots, surgeons, etc., but also potentially a degree of envy. And finally, a lack of warmth and a lack of competence is closer to something like disapproval or disgust. And this has been shown in a number of studies to broadly be true. Perhaps the more interesting question for today is how these kind of characteristics might map onto animals. And these studies have also been done. So what do we see? Well, bottom left, so we see there low competence and low warmth, feelings of disgust. We see things like rats, snakes, lizards, fish, chickens, and so on. Bottom right, highly competent, but still low warmth. We see things like whales, bears, lions, and so on. Top left, low competence, but we feel warmly towards, endearing and cute, but maybe a little pitiful. So things like rabbits, ducks, and birds. And top right, high warmth and high competence, which breeds a feeling of pride, seems to include dogs and cats, elephants, and of course, horses. So I think it's quite instructive perhaps to acknowledge that most people instinctively put horses into the same emotional space as dogs, cats, elephants, and monkeys, i.e. competent, smart animals, but also ones to which we feel a degree of warmth and amiability. So that's quite a potent combination, and of course goes some way to explain the high demands the public will impose on your industry. So that sets a high bar. Now, of course, an expert in horse welfare, in horse neurology and animal behavior might argue whether that perception is right or wrong. I'm not commenting either way because it's not my area of expertise. But the point is, this is where the public are at an instinctive and emotional level. And of course, that's what we have to deal with. So that, I think, shines a bit of a light on some of the attitudes and quirks and biases of the public when thinking about horses, whether for right or for wrong. And I want to flip, as I said, my attention in the other direction. So I'm not going to, of course, talk about the psychology of horse owners per se. It's not something I'm aware of many studies on. I also fear it might become a slightly patronizing and challenging task, given the audience. So what I'm going to do instead is just highlight a few interesting principles from an area where there is much more research, and that is essentially from the study on meat consumption. And apologies, my phone is just, the screen is just frozen for a second, so just bear with me. Okay, so I just want to highlight really four sort of brief studies. So firstly, maybe actually I'll just explain the title on this slide first. The meat paradox. It's among this sort of field of study, it's often argued to be a paradox because there seems to be quite a big disconnect between the number of people who eat meat and the number of people who also claim to be animal lovers and seem at face value, and when asked, to be against many of the common practices within the livestock sector. So I think it's quite interesting to understand and unpack what's going on there psychologically and where this contradiction comes from. So I'm going to do that just by running through four quite interesting studies. So firstly, on average, those who eat meat perceive the mental capacity of farmed animals as lower than of pets, whereas non-meaters do not make this distinction. And just to draw the sort of painful analogy there, we could ponder whether horse users might see a difference between horses and dogs, whereas non-horse users see less of a difference, for example. And again, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, just pointing out the need to recognize the different emotional and psychological relationships that horse owners versus non-horse owners might have with those animals, and the need to sort of understand that. But I think it gets more interesting when we look at studies 2, 3, and 4. So study 2, people working with meat, so butchers, deli workers, etc., were found to have less empathy for the slaughter of animals and were less likely to draw a mental connection between meat and its animal origins, But here's a really interesting thing. This disconnect only emerges after sort of 6 months or so of working with meat. So it's not just the fact that animal lovers don't take jobs at butchers, it's that working in a butcher's causes you to become more emotionally disconnected with animals. So it's, in other words, a sort of psychologically adaptive process. Now, again, just to avoid any daft comparisons, I'm not saying that horse owners become morally or psychologically more distant from the welfare of their horses. I think actually you could equally argue the complete opposite, in that horse owners may be more attuned to the welfare of the animals than anyone else outside the sector could be. I'm just simply pointing out that as humans, we have the capacity for, and indeed it's really the norm, for these kind of biases of rationalization and strategic preservation psychologically. So we should acknowledge at least that our own behaviors, our habits, our life choices will influence what we believe to be right. I think we like to think that we have a sort of moral principle and our behaviors flow from that. But actually, the opposite is also true, in that we adopt moral perspectives that fit comfortably with our behaviors. So in the words of Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer, humans are not rational animals so much as rationalizing animals. Study 3. In a randomized controlled experiment, people were shown pictures of cows and sheep. One group of people randomly selected were told that those animals would be eating grass. Another group randomly selected were told that they were on their way to slaughter. They were then asked to rate the mental capacities of these animals. The meat eaters in the group, told about the slaughter, rated lower mental capacities among the animals compared to meat eaters told about the animals grazing. And this difference was not observed among non-meat eaters. In other words, reminding a meat eater about the slaughter process causes them to immediately believe livestock aren't as sentient. So this, again, is quite strong and controlled and causal evidence that our relationship with animals is not necessarily based on an objective or a rational or a consistent set of beliefs. It is also, in large part, a constructed belief in the moment to help us manage or reconcile or make sense of our own behavior. And so when you remind someone of something, a sort of reality that perhaps conflicts with their behavior, they will adopt sort of psychological mechanisms to reconcile that, including perhaps just not wanting to think about it. And finally, study 4, participants were presented with information about pigs and dogs being used for meat. They were then offered more information about the intelligence of these creatures. And what we see is that meat eaters in the group showed what would be called strategic avoidance of that information. In other words, they did not want to know about the intelligence of pigs because the meat eaters in the group ate pigs. They were fine with information about the intelligence of dogs because they did not eat dogs, even though some others do. Whereas non-meat eaters did not show this difference at all because, of course, for them, there was no psychological threat at all associated with that additional information. So, pause for breath. What's going on here? Really, the answer lies in this notion of cognitive dissonance, which is a phrase I'm sure many have heard of. It's essentially a tension between two contradictory but equally held beliefs or behaviors. So specifically, for example, a lot of us might simultaneously recognize that we eat meat, but also think, well, I'm not a bad person, and also think I care about animals, and also really are aware of some of the suffering that is incumbent in meat production. And yet somehow we manage to hold all of those beliefs at the same time. So the question is how we psychologically essentially resolve that dissonance. And logically, there are two possible strategies. We either change our behavior to be more consistent with our beliefs, in other words, we stop eating meat, or we edit and contort our beliefs to sort of fudge the contradiction so that we don't have to change our behavior. And quite often that is what we will do. So if I eat meat and I think I'm not a bad person, logically I must conclude that eating meat must be fine, and I can rationalize this in all sorts of ways through things like normalization. Everyone does it, it's natural. Minimization, I don't eat all that much, I try to buy the good stuff. Dehumanization, animals aren't capable of suffering in that way, it's only a pig, cow, sheep. Perhaps moral licensing, oh, I do my bit in other ways, I give to an animal charity, etc. Or indeed, we might, on the other hand, kind of, I guess, conveniently overlook the fact that agriculture might cause suffering to animals. So again, we can have things going on like willful ignorance or avoidance of the issue. We might react against the do-gooders because they make us feel a bit bad. They point out the uncomfortable truths that we don't really want to engage with, and so on. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on there. I want to just pause quickly partway through this presentation and give a few conclusions so far. So firstly, our own psychology is often a bit mysterious to us. We have attitudes and beliefs which are perhaps visible on the surface and open to introspection, but there's also quite a lot of bias going on. There's these mental acrobatics that we all employ, cognitive errors and hidden motivations, which are perhaps a little bit less visible to introspection. So we shouldn't assume that our own view on a topic is objective or personally rational or has been brought about through some kind of context-free, true sort of sovereign process. We're very much enmeshed in our own cognitive works, but also within the context and society that our opinions are formed within. And so, whilst of course there are two sides to the issue of equine social license, we should be aware of our own quirks and our own biases when critiquing the other side. On the other hand, on the one hand, we know that, of course, lots of people do deeply care about animals. We also see that people tend to lump horses in with cats and dogs, so we shouldn't be surprised by the high demands from society. Indeed, perhaps that's actually a good thing overall. The opposite might be more problematic for the sector. And of course, that empathy can become overblown because of our tendency to anthropomorphize even inanimate objects, let alone other animals. And of course, yes, that might also come with a degree of ignorance or be amplified by a degree of ignorance, perhaps some virtue signaling as well. That's all natural sort of part of human nature. But also, on the other hand, those who do, in the studies we just looked at, eat, but I think perhaps by extension we should look at how some of those findings might shine a light on those who work with, use animals, etc. will surely have their own biases too, and we should be sensitive to the possibility that our own established behaviors or the practices within industry might, through the quirks of our psychology that we're all prone to, lead us to sort of rationalize, normalize practices that may deserve some scrutiny from time to time. Okay, that's sort of part one, I guess, of the presentation, where I wanted to talk a bit about some of the psychology of this tension. The remainder, I'm just going to whiz through a few concrete techniques for behavior change, so things that you can hopefully sort of use in your day-to-day work, particularly looking internally within your own organization or externally amongst the other stakeholders and audience whom you may wish to sort of encourage or influence to adopt certain actions. And I want to do that just by running through our EAST framework. So the EAST framework is really just a very simple toolkit that we've established. It essentially consolidates and simplifies a vast body of behavioral science research into 4 simple techniques. Its central premise is that if you want to encourage a particular behavior, it's a good idea to make that behavior easy, attractive, social, and timely. And so I'm just going to whiz through each of those 4 categories and give one example for each. So firstly, how can we make something easy? Well, when we say easy, we mean a few different things. So firstly, we can set intelligent defaults. So what happens by default? What happens to people? What outcome do they end up with if they just go with the flow? So for instance, one of the most successful behaviorally informed policies of the last decade or so in the UK would be the auto-enrollment into private workplace pension. So previously, one would have to proactively opt into a private workplace pension. That was flipped so that you had to proactively opt out if you didn't want one. And pretty much overnight, the number of people saving for retirement through a private pension, I think more than doubled. We also see that in the space I work in a lot, in the climate change space. If you default people into green renewable electricity tariffs, you allow them to switch tariff if they want to, you can lead to as much as a 10-fold increase in the proportion of customers on green renewable electricity. So defaults are hugely powerful. But we also want to reduce the hassle involved in processes and actions and simplify communications as far as we can. So we found, for instance, that even doing something as simple as removing a couple of unnecessary mouse clicks in an online tax return form can significantly increase tax compliance. In one study we did by as much as 22%. But the example I want to just give in a little bit more detail relates to reducing hassle. So we've done some work in Indonesia with farmers in rural areas. And this project looked at human-wildlife conflict, essentially trying to encourage farmers to build tiger-proof enclosures around their livestock, because when they don't, not only might they face a risk of losing livestock to wildlife, but also if a tiger does encroach on their land, they'd have a greater tendency to kill it rather than to simply protect their livestock and leave the tiger be. But this is not that straightforward because actually these are rural, relatively low income areas. There is upfront cost associated with building these enclosures and quite a lot of hassle as well in terms of getting the materials. Some of these farmers might maybe own a moped but not a car, so bringing in the building materials to remote villages is not straightforward. When we went out there, the local NGOs that we were engaging with were, I guess, doing what we might call the conventional approach, which is to say education and outreach and so on, trying to communicate the importance of wildlife conservation, essentially trying to translate their own values of wildlife conservation onto the local community. We wanted to try something a bit different and simply make the building of tiger-proof enclosures a lot easier and also a bit cheaper. So we simply provided free barbed wire, which, by the way, costs rather less than running educational and outreach programs in these areas. We did that in 2 variations and then ran a little randomized control trial to see which would work better. One was these farmers could request free barbed wire. Another was that it was just given directly to them whether they wanted it or not. And then we set a deadline. So if they didn't build a tiger-proof enclosure within 2 months, we'd come back and take the barbed wire back. Now, there wasn't a big enough sample to run a truly robust large-scale evaluation. But what we did find is that over 20 villages where we did this, the only farmers who built any tiger-proof enclosures were in that second group where the barbed wire was given for free and it would be removed and taken back if they didn't use it within a 2-month window. So simplifying it, providing it for free, and then also putting what we call this sort of deadline effect to try and overcome sort of procrastination seemed to be effective in this case. Secondly, how can we make behaviors more attractive, where we can simply draw people's attention to the relevant, salient, pertinent information? We can personalize experiences and service designs. We tend to engage with something much more if we feel like it's relevant and personalized to us. And we can also provide incentives. And the study of incentives is, of course, a big area of behavioral science research. I often point towards the plastic bag charge in the UK as an interesting example. It's only a 10p charge, and yet it's, according to the government data, led to a 98% reduction in single-use plastic bag use in the UK. And of course, economically, it's quite a weak incentive. It's 10p, and you might have 5, 10, 20 pounds worth of shopping in that plastic bag. But what it's doing is it's also crowding in a default, because now you have to ask for one rather than just taking one off the rack, as well as providing a new sort of social norm in that there's a bit of a taboo to ask for one. And you have to sort of proactively engage with the cashier to take one. So those sort of psychological factors, those nudges, are being brought in by the introduction of an incentive. So the incentive itself does more than just provide an economic cost. But by way of example, in terms of how we make something attractive, salient, provide the most relevant information as simply as possible, we ran an interesting trial with Unilever through their Dove products. We were trying to increase the rates of recycling within bathrooms. Again, very simple thing. All we did is that instead of having the slightly convoluted and confusing official recycling label on the back of the bottles, we just have those big green stickers on the front saying "Recycle me," just reminding people in the moment to do so. We also provided free recycling caddies that people could hang on the back of their bathroom door, because we found that not many people had separate bins in their bathroom. They just have one bin that everything goes into, unlike in the kitchen. What we found by doing those 2 things, which in a sense makes it more attractive, more salient, but also easier, is that we roughly, essentially, one way of interpreting that data is that we roughly halved the number of people who were not recycling their products properly. So from sort of 9% down to 5% were not recycling their products properly. And that was a large-scale randomized controlled trial across thousands of households. Thirdly, how can we make behaviors social? One thing we can do is highlight the helpful social norms. So we are social creatures. We tend to follow the crowd a little bit. We feel a little bit of peer pressure to conform with what others are doing. And we also use what others are doing as a useful indication of what is sensible, what is right, what is morally acceptable, what is probably in our best interest, and so on. So simply communicating that, most people are doing this thing can be actually quite effective, and is a very well-evidenced technique in the sort of nudge literature. We can also leverage networks in order to help good norms and practices spread. And we can use reciprocity effects, which is to say that if I do something for you, or if I perhaps concede to an extent, then you might do something for me or concede in return. So it's a sort of, I guess, a negotiation tactic, but it's something which we can also use to encourage and support behaviors. So in this particular example here, we worked with an organization called Reach and some other charities to launch a program called Britain Connects, which was live during COVID, essentially trying to sort of heal some of the political polarization that had emerged post-Brexit. And we felt like when lots of people are at home and isolated, that's a good moment to try and sort of inspire some conversations between disparate groups. So all it was a simple text prompt to people and an online conversation platform that we created. And we matched people with their political opposites. So for example, people who voted for and against Brexit, or people that by other dimensions had quite opposing political views and values. What we found is that those who had the meetings felt 70% warmer towards their political outgroup than those who didn't. And again, this was in a randomized controlled trial to get a sort of strong causal evidence point on the effect of this kind of intervention. They were also certainly 70% more likely to share contact details with the person they had a conversation with, to maintain that sort of relationship and that conversation afterwards. So I guess one insight here is simply that engaging more with the quote unquote outgroup, or those that we have disagreements with, seems to, or different values and beliefs to, is well evidenced as a way of sort of healing some of those divergent views. But also, I suppose the point here is that what we wanted to tackle were the frictions associated with doing that. How can we make it dead easy to actually engage with the opposition, and simply creating a platform that enabled that proved to be an effective intervention. And then finally, how can we make something timely? Again, a few different things we can do here. So firstly, we can consider the immediate costs and benefits of an action. We tend to steeply discount the future as human beings. That is to say, the benefits and the costs that are incurred immediately loom much greater in our minds than the ones further down the line. So if we can bring forward the positives, the savings, etc., and push back the negatives and the costs, people will tend to be more willing to engage. We can also help people plan. Many behaviors are complex, take multiple steps. And so simplifying that, chunking that down, helping them plan, helping them put in commitments that sort of cause them to stick to those plans, that can be a really helpful technique where a more sort of involved transition is required. And finally, we want to prompt people when they are most likely to be receptive. And that's an example I want to just briefly highlight as my final example. The point here is that we tend to have what we call sort of moments of change or windows of opportunity through our lives. So when perhaps a behavior is already being disrupted, a habit is otherwise being stopped, that is a precious window of opportunity to encourage a new behavior. So for example, we did some work in Portland in the US where we want to encourage people to take up a new cycle share scheme. The intervention itself was a very simple one. They were essentially sending out promotional leaflets with some little vouchers on to local residents. But the interesting insight from our perspective is that when you send those promotional materials to people who had just moved home, they were roughly 4 times as likely to use the scheme as compared to a matched cohort who already lived in the area and were the same distance from these cycle docks. But of course, the point is that those who have just moved home had already had to disrupt their usual travel routines and habits, so were more open to exploring new alternatives. And there are many, many moments in people's lives. In fact, it's quite a useful and interesting exercise, perhaps for your own sector. Think about some of the behaviors you'd like to encourage and try and identify when are the timely moments when they might be most receptive to information, when the behavior is perhaps being interrupted or needs to be renewed for some reason. When you can actually get much more bang for your buck by intervening or communicating at that moment in time. Okay, I had one final example that I'm going to skip for time, so I'll leave it there, and thank you so much, and back to you, Roly.
I hope you have enjoyed this event and you've been inspired by the stories of our speakers. And I especially hope you now have a deeper understanding on many of the social license issues that have faced both equestrian and non-equestrian industries over recent years. And if I were to take away just 3 key thoughts from today, these would be, firstly, please use what you have learned here today. Go back into your communities and discuss how you can put these strategies into action. You have seen how action is not only necessary, but often immensely beneficial. Secondly, social license is much more than just a communications exercise. It's about action, changing our organization's attitudes to the public, our critics, and our horses, and demanding more of ourselves to evolve sustainably. And finally, World Horse Welfare is here to help. We will continue to work with sport regulators, and we will continue to measure public acceptance of equestrian sport, both in the UK and more widely. In June this year, we will share the results of a new UK survey, so we can all keep our finger on the pulse of public perception and trust. Equestrianism can and must change, but making that change into a reality, future-proofing our sport, is up to all of us. Thank you.